Okay, I think it is working. Okay, so hi, everybody. And if I could ask everyone to please mute yourselves, that those of you who are online. Thanks for your patience in our being absent for the last couple of weeks. And we are ready to resume. So here's where we are in the Kuzari. Oh, for some reason, someone took out all the place markers, but that's okay. All right. We were talking about, well, before we took a break, we talked about a very important topic, which is rabbinic knowledge, rabbinic wisdom. And many times people try to segregate knowledge and relegate the rabbi's wisdom to purely Torah topics. But what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was attempting to demonstrate was that when you look at the breadth of wisdom that the rabbis needed to possess in order to teach us about how to practice Judaism, you see that they had a comprehensive working of so many areas of science and medicine that is really truly admirable and only adds to the prestige of our rabbinic tradition, knowing that the custodians of that tradition really possessed a huge amount of knowledge. Okay, that's really, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's whole work, his life work, was to proudly display our tradition to his own people and to the rest of the world, letting the world know how amazing Judaism is, and how robust and rich our tradition is as far as its being the custodian of so much knowledge and bringing so much light to the world. And that was especially important to him in writing the Kuzari, because he did notice that because he's living in Andalusia, southern Spain, which is dominated by the Muslim faith and Muslim Islamic philosophy, that he felt that Judaism was sort of under attack, not active attack, but it was under sort of a criticism by other faiths who looked condescendingly upon Judaism and said, what does it have to offer the world? Okay, maybe it was like the initial seed that was the kernel of growth for Christianity and Islam. But what is Judaism possibly? What can it possibly provide? If you'll recall from the very beginning of the Kuzari, where the king of the Khazars has this dream, and he's visited in a dream by an angel, and the angel says, "Your intentions are desirable, but not your deeds. You need to improve your behavior." And so he was so disturbed by this recurring dream that he summoned in wise men from all over the world. He brings in a Greek philosopher. He brings in an Islamic qadi, an Islamic judge. He brings in a Christian cleric, a priest. And he summons in a rabbi too, to sort of round out the roster. But if you remember from the sequence of the people whose advice he sought, he speaks to the rabbi last in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's reenactment of what allegedly took place in the Khazar court. Okay, and one of the statements of the Khazar king was, after hearing the rabbi's opening words, were, "I was correct in only asking you to speak last, because your words strike me as being so foolish that you've only confirmed my suspicion about the Jews, that they have very little to offer the world by way of wisdom, because after all, you've been an itinerant people wandering for centuries. And after you've been wandering for such a long time, your brains probably have suffered as a result of all that wandering, because that's what happens to people who are constant wanderers, is that they don't have an opportunity to cultivate wisdom as much as people who are stationary in one place can set up academies and universities and really cultivate their knowledge." But that's only his initial response. But once he is able to hear out the rabbi more comprehensively, he starts to realize that Judaism does have very profound wisdom. And that's what eventually causes him to convert to Judaism. And that's the story of the Khazars. Now, let's revisit that, but coming at it from the opposite direction, which is a very interesting question from the Khazar king. After I've gotten through telling you, says the rabbi, that the rabbis possessed Sefer Yetzirah wisdom, the wisdom of the book of creation. They possess great knowledge of astronomy because they need to intercalate the calendar between and reconcile the movement of the moon and the sun. And all of this other scientific knowledge, which we're going to see later on, this leads to a very logical question. And the question is, if so, and this is where we are on page 484 in the Kuzari in the Feldheim edition, the rabbi concludes his initial statements by saying, the other areas of science that we find casually interspersed among the writings of the sages and which are not meant to instruct us about those areas of wisdom are nevertheless wondrous and amazing. In other words, the rabbis never compiled textbooks on anatomy, textbooks on biology, textbooks on astronomy. They never did that. They presented us with a Talmud, which provides us a comprehensive body of knowledge about how to live your life as a Jew, and other, provided with also ethical stories and information. But when we find knowledge of these areas of science interspersed within the Talmud, we are amazed with what we read. Don't you think that the Jewish wise men possessed books that address these areas of wisdom? The Kuzari says, well, if so, how is it that those books which were written intentionally for those subjects were lost, whereas the books that only mention these things incidentally were preserved? Why don't the Jewish people have, as part of their national library, books on astronomy and biology and anatomy and so forth? Like, what happened to those books? You've got a Chumash, you've got a Tanakh, you've got Mishnayos, you've got a Talmud, but what about all of those other areas of wisdom? Now, one could potentially answer that question by saying, well, yes, we had all of these other areas of wisdom, but we didn't feel it was important to transmit these areas of wisdom because we left it up to the other nations. That could be one answer, but that's not the answer that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi gives, probably because that's an insufficient answer. If you really do need a working knowledge of astronomy in order to calculate the Jewish calendar, wouldn't it have been prudent for the rabbis to pass down a fuller, more robust textbook on astronomy to help future generations know how to calculate the Jewish calendar? And if you need a proper working on medicine, a proper working knowledge of medicine, in order to know how to diagnose tzaraat, in order to know how to properly diagnose whether a woman is a nida or a zava, two different kinds of conditions of menstrual discharge, or if a man has an abnormal discharge versus a regular discharge, wouldn't these works on gynecology and urology have been useful for rabbis to study in and of themselves? And if so, why don't we have those traditions intact? What happened to those works? That's the question. Anyone bothered by the question, or are you okay with the question? Yes, go ahead, Rachel.
I don't know that it's a question, because when we say that everything is in the Torah, we don't mean necessarily that every aspect of science is in the Torah. What it means is that you can look in the Torah to see how you should act, how you should proceed, but that's not to say that somebody wouldn't engage in an outside source of science to accumulate knowledge before he makes his decision based on the Torah.
Okay, so you're saying that the Torah may not contain a comprehensive knowledge of everything, and that's fine. remember, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi himself, before we broke, for a couple of weeks, we read a direct quote from the Kuzari that had stated, let me just remind you, these sages were involved with these studies only for the sake of the Torah. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi himself acknowledges studying astronomy just because you want to know what the atmosphere of Venus is like is not really a project that was ever undertaken by our tradition. In other words, knowledge qua knowledge is not something that the Torah advocates. That's according to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. We said that the Rambam vociferously disagrees with that, right? But for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, knowledge for the sake of knowledge is not an important thing in the eyes of Hashem, in the eyes of the Torah. But that being said, he also said that a working knowledge of so many different disciplines within science is necessary in order to know halacha. And so that's where this question comes from. If I need to know how the universe works in order to know how to codify law, why isn't this knowledge part of our transmission? Why wasn't it transmitted? Yeah.
Jewish people are very smart, so they can. This information has been shared orally, and people can speak of these subjects, and we don't need.
Oh, okay. So maybe there's an oral transmission, an esoteric transmission that was secretly or esoterically passed down among the really smart rabbis, and the general populace who didn't need these disciplines in order to lead their lives as good Jews never possessed them.
Like the skill of being for the Rosh Chodesh and knowing that that's a skill that's being transmitted. So the way in which we can bring down that scientific information into practice to be good Jews, that's how it's been brought down to the people. And we don't need to know all those details, but there are those who do know.
Okay, I want you to hold on to that idea. That's a very interesting idea. First, let's read Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's answer, and then I want to share with you something that the Rambam writes. So the rabbi said, this is because, in other words, why don't we have separate works on different areas of scientific knowledge? He says it's because these books were known only to special people who had titles such as astronomer, doctor, surgeon, and so forth. When a nation becomes dispersed, the first thing that is lost is its distinguished echelon, to be followed later by the lower echelons. When you have Jews who are persecuted and pursued and chased all over the globe, the people who get lost first from the Jewish society are the people with the PhDs, is essentially what he's saying. And basically, because they're so small in number, they're the ones who fade from the annals of Jewish history first. These distinguished people with us lost, and their wisdom was lost with them. All that was left were the Torah scrolls, which the masses needed. Most of the people knew the Torah, transcribed it, and studied it a great deal. Therefore, as a result of widespread knowledge of and attention to these writings, anything that was discussed incidentally in the Talmudic books regarding these areas of wisdom was preserved. So that's all we have left. Basically, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says, we used to have books and writings on these topics, but they were lost. They were lost to the sands of time, to the mists of time, right, as they say, right? But we used to have this knowledge. And if you remember, he had said previously in the Kuzari that all of the secular knowledge that's available from the Greeks mostly, and now from their Islamic heirs who took Greek philosophy and filtered it into Arabic for the Arabic-speaking world, they really got all of that knowledge originally from us. We lost it because of our itinerant and persecuted history, but the rest of the world preserved it and just used different terminology for what was always ours. So that's his answer. Okay, now this is a very important point, and it's important to know that the Rambam believes the same idea. But the Rambam takes it one step further. And I want to share with you my screen now to share with you something that the Rambam writes about other areas of very sophisticated knowledge. Here, let me just bring up that second. Why isn't it coming up? Let's see. Okay. Sorry, just give me a sec. That's not it. I apologize. Here we are. Here we go. Okay. Can my people in TV land, do you see this? The loss of sophisticated knowledge within Jewish tradition. Okay. This is an important topic for our medieval thinkers, who themselves are deeply philosophical, deeply introspective, deeply rational in their thinking. And they seek to be able to reconcile the more simplistic nature of the texts that we do possess in our tradition with the more modern, sophisticated knowledge of our times. And the question is, how do you reconcile the fact that the Torah's wisdom is timeless and yet does not always seem to be keeping pace with the advancement of knowledge that we have in more modern times? And so, and if the Torah is based on divine knowledge and divine wisdom, wouldn't you expect it to contain the greatest depths of wisdom, even greater than anything that human beings can come up with today? That's the perennial question that you'll find being asked by so many of our commentators who wish to pursue an intellectual approach to Jewish wisdom. So the Rambam here is coming from a slightly different context. He's talking about a Mishnah that appears in Tractate Chagiga, which we've seen before. The Mishnah in Tractate Chagiga says, Ein Dorshin, that you're not allowed to expound on certain topics, on certain disciplines in Jewish thought in public. So for example, when it comes to sexual matters, you can't publicly lecture about that. There's a lack of tzniut. And then the Mishnah says, "V'lo b'ma'aseh v'reishit b'shnayim, v'lo merkava b'yachid, ele im ken haya chacham u'mevin mida'ato." That there are two other disciplines within Jewish wisdom that you're not allowed to expound upon publicly. One is called ma'aseh b'reishit, and you're only allowed to discuss that with one student at a time. You have to transmit Ma'aseh Bereshit, the act of creation, to one student at a time. Now, what is the act of creation? So different commentaries explain, but they all converge upon the same idea. How did the universe come into existence? This is a very esoteric area of knowledge, and it's not easy for the mind to grasp. And so therefore, it should not be lectured publicly, this topic. And v'lo b'merkava b'yachid, ele im ken haya chacham u'mevin mida'ato. And there's an even more sophisticated area of knowledge called ma'aseh merkava, which literally means the act of the chariot, which is the chariot of God is described in great detail in the first chapter of Ezekiel, and then again in the 10th chapter of Ezekiel. To jog your memory, on the first day of Shavuot, the Haftorah for the Torah reading on the first day of Shavuos is from the first chapter of Yecheskel, and it describes Yecheskel's vision of the skies opening and him seeing God's chariot. And the chariot has four sides, and each side of the chariot has a different face. And there are angels all around, and it's very strange and bizarre and mystical and mysterious, and we don't really understand it. Now, the Mishnah says that that topic, you can't even teach one student unless that student is exceptional in his understanding. So when it comes to the act of creation, one student at a time. When it comes to the act of the chariot, one student at a time, provided that the student is an exceptional student. Okay, but if he's not exceptional, then you can never transmit it. You can't just, anyone who wants, like if the guy knocks on the rabbi's door and says, I want you to teach me Ma'aseh Merkava. No, just because you want to know doesn't mean it's accessible to you, right? Okay, so comes along the Rambam, and he talks about this in a few places in the guide. But here's one thing, the one thing I want us to see together is his introduction to the guide of the third and final section of the guide in the Moreh Nevuchim. We have stated several times that it is our primary object in this treatise to expound as far as possible the biblical account of the creation, Ma'aseh Bereshit, and the description of the divine chariot, Ma'aseh Merkava, in a manner adapted to the training of those for whom this work is written. Now, what that last phrase is, in a manner adapted to the training, meaning I've written the Guide for the Perplexed for those who have philosophical training. So I want to make sure that I can explain it to you using that methodology. We have also stated that these subjects belong to the mysteries of the law, what we call Sitrei Torah in Hebrew. You are well aware how our sages blame those who reveal these mysteries and praise the merits of those who keep them secret, although they are perfectly clear to the philosopher. In this sense, they explain the passage, quoting from Isaiah, her merchandise shall be for them that dwell before the Lord to eat sufficiently, which concludes in the original with the words, V'limekaseh atik, that these blessings are promised to him who hides things which the Eternal has revealed, namely Sitrei Torah, the mysteries of the law. If you have an understanding, you will comprehend that which our sages pointed out. They have clearly stated that the divine chariot includes matters too deep and too profound for the ordinary intellect. It has been shown that a person favored by providence with reason to understand these mysteries is forbidden by law to teach them except viva voce, right? Which is what? How would you translate that? By voice, right? In other words, you can only transmit them orally, as Rachel had said, and on condition that the pupil possess certain qualifications, and even then, only the heads of the sections may be communicated. In other words, only the synopsis of the information. This has been the cause why the knowledge of this mystery has entirely disappeared from our nation, and nothing has remained of it. Now, what does this remind you of? It's very reminiscent of what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is discussing. But the Rambam says that he doesn't get into the idea of a nation that is that of a wandering nation, only to special people. And when a nation becomes dispersed, when we go into Golus, the first thing that is lost is its distinguished echelon. So the Rambam doesn't talk about the idea of the Jews being a dispersed nation, having to go through different iterations of wandering. He just says that there are certain aspects of esoteric knowledge which by nature of their esoteric quality cannot be transmitted to the common folk. So it's a slightly different approach. Remember, the Rambam was an elitist. He felt that you can't handle the truth, like Jack Nicholson famously said. His attitude was only special people can receive sophisticated knowledge. It's not meant for the general populace. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's attitude was, everyone has access. Why then don't we have these works? Because we went into Golus and we lost them. Such being the case, and so the Rambam now says, now that I've pointed out that not everyone is capable of this knowledge, how can I venture to call your attention to such portions of it as it may be known, intelligible, and perfectly clear to me? What right do I have to share with you this esoteric knowledge if not everyone is meant to have it? Then he says, but if, on the other hand, I were to abstain from writing on this subject, according to my opinion, When I die, as I shall inevitably do, that knowledge would die with me, and I would thus inflict great injury upon you and all those who are perplexed by these theological problems. I would then be guilty of withholding the truth from those to whom it ought to be communicated, and of jealousy depriving the heir of his inheritance. I should, in either case, be guilty of gross misconduct. He's basically saying, I'm damned if I do, I'm damned if I don't. If I don't reveal this information, it will die with me, and the next generation will be that much poorer for it. But if I do reveal this information, I run the risk of providing knowledge that you can't handle, that you can't handle this truth. To give a full explanation of the mystic passages of the Bible is contrary to the law and to reason. Besides, my knowledge of them is based on reasoning, not on divine inspiration, and is therefore not infallible. Now listen carefully to what the Rambam writes. He says, I never received a tradition on Ma'aseh Bereshit and Ma'aseh Merkava from my forebears. My Rebbeim never taught me about this stuff. I'm passing it on to you based on the fact that I have philosophical training, and therefore I've been able to infer what these texts mean based on my knowledge of philosophy. So he readily admits that it could be I'm making a mistake, which is such a beautiful thing for us to remember. The Rambam, in his humility, says, recognize that I'm not getting this as a tradition. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says, any knowledge that we have is based on our tradition. The Rambam says, I don't have that knowledge. I got it from my philosophical training because I went to a university or whatever, or however he learned philosophy. I have not received my belief in this respect from any teacher, but it has been formed by what I learned from scripture and the utterances of our sages, and by the philosophical principles which I have adopted. It is therefore possible that my view is wrong and that I misunderstood the passages referred to. And by the way, that's such a valuable sentence. The reason why it's valuable is because the Rambam based his understanding of Ma'aseh Bereshit and Ma'aseh Merkava on Aristotle and his philosophical knowledge of Aristotelian philosophy. We've debunked Aristotle in around the 17th century. And since then, an entirely new system of understanding the workings of the universe was adopted by society and the scientific community. But the Rambam is basically saying that doesn't mean that the endeavor of explaining Ma'aseh Bereshit and Ma'aseh Merkava is a wrong endeavor. I could be wrong by basing myself on Aristotle. He readily admits that. And that's why, even though some people might say, well, if the Rambam is basing himself on outdated science, what's the benefit of studying his writings on this topic? And the answer is because he's providing us with a map. And the map is follow these disciplines based on the best knowledge that you have of scientific reality of your day. And if you can explain these traditions based on modern science, then that's great, because modern science is your friend. It is not your enemy, as some people believe, that science and Torah are not reconcilable. Just to the contrary, the Rambam says, use the science of your day to explain these passages in Tanakh and to explain the Talmud. Correct thought and divine help have suggested to me the proper method to explain the words of the prophet Yechezkel in such a manner that those who will read my interpretation will believe that I have not added anything to the contents of the text, but only, as it were, translated from one language into another or given a short exposition of plain things. In other words, all I'm doing is taking the text of the book of Yechezkel, chapter 1, and repackaging it using Aristotelian philosophy. So something that would look to a person as being completely otherworldly and irreconcilable with science, when reading the book, the description of the chariot, the Rambam says, those four faces on the four sides of the chariot, oh, those are the four elements on the periodic table of Aristotle, right? And when you read about emanation that comes down from the chariot into our world, that's actually being described in a way that is completely compatible with the way that Aristotle understands how the elements come into our world and and multiply and variegate and so forth. Okay, so that's what he's saying. Those, however, for whom this treatise has been composed, will, on reflecting on it and thoroughly examining each chapter, obtain a perfect and clear insight into all that has been clear and intelligible to me. This is the utmost that can be done in treating the subject so as to be useful to all without fully explaining it. And then after this introductory remark, I'm now going to get into a discussion of Ma'aseh Merkava. And that's exactly what he does in the third section of the guide. Okay? So what I wanted to provide you just two different viewpoints that really do converge or at least intersect in this Venn diagram, which is you have Rabbi Yehuda Halevi saying, we did have a perfect working knowledge of the universe and all of scientific wisdom. We lost it when we lost all of our PhDs and our physicians, okay, because we went into Gullus. But that knowledge, much of it still is with us based on the incidental passages that we find interspersed throughout the Talmud. The Rambam's attitude is that much of our scientific knowledge was forgotten because it is so sophisticated that it was never meant for the common man. And as such, it was never written down. For Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, that's not the correct answer. But at least, because he feels that these things should have been written down so that people could pass this knowledge down. But Gullus, these things happen, we lose the scrolls. The intersection between the two of them is they both acknowledge that Judaism used to have much more robust knowledge than what it appears to have today. Okay? If you recall, when we were learning about the Hebrew language many moons ago in the Kuzari, in the second section of the Kuzari, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi also said, Hebrew is the most robust language known to man because it comes from God. If Hebrew is the most robust language, then why is it that the Arabic dictionary is so much thicker than the Hebrew dictionary? The Hebrew dictionary has a much more limited vocabulary than the Arabic dictionary. And what was the answer? The answer was, we lost most of our words because we went into Gullus and Hebrew became a dead language. It was no longer the spoken language. And as such, the only vocabulary of the Hebrew language that remains are the words of Tanakh. And that's why when we came back to Israel, to Eretz Yisrael in the 20th century, people like Ben Yehuda and others and Alkali had to reinvent new Hebrew words for things that the Hebrew language did not have descriptions for. Not just because based on new technologies, but things, even everyday things that were simply not mentioned in Tanakh, did not have Hebrew words for them. Okay? Yes?
Speaking of the Merkava, would that not be like, remember Chashmal, right? Chashmal is electricity and water.
Yeah, great example.
Merkava. I don't know if that's a connection, but maybe.
Well, that is the connection. Where does the word chashmal come from? It comes from Ezekiel, right? The flashing bright lights of the angels is called chashmal. Is it electricity? Maybe, maybe not, but it's close enough. Yeah. Okay. All right. So do we have an understanding here of what's going on? We have both Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Rambam openly expressing this idea that so much of our tradition was lost over the course of the centuries. And there is a project that they both seem to advocate, which is recapture the lost tradition. If for the Rambam, only recapture that tradition if you're up to the task, right? And for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, was more of a populist, more of a person who says that everyone has equal access to Torah knowledge. It's just lost because we lost it, because we went into Gullus, but there's so much knowledge that is still there, and it's virtuous to try and find that knowledge if it'll help your understanding of Torah. Okay? All right, so that's what I wanted to present for today in the Kuzari. Let's go on to the Parsha, unless there are any questions, comments. Okay, let's go on. The title of today's Devar Torah for Parshat Yisro is Running Away and Running Towards. And what I want to do is sort of examine Yitro, Moshe's father-in-law, and I want us to think about what attracted him to Judaism. Okay, so the Torah starts off by saying, "Vayishma Yisro Chohen Midyan Chosein Moshe," that Yitro, who was the priest of Midyan, Moshe's father-in-law, hears. He hears about Eit Kol Asher Asa Elokim LaMoshe LiYisrael Amo. He hears about everything that Hashem has done to Moshe and to Israel, his nation. Ki hotzi Hashem et Yisrael miMitzrayim, that God took Israel out of Egypt. Now, we have a comment from the Talmud. Talmud in Tractate Zvachim, and this is also repeated in the Mechilta, which is a midrash, debates what it is exactly that Yitro heard. What is it that he heard that attracted him, that prompted him to come out into the desert and sort of seek to attach himself to his son-in-law? Remember, his son-in-law basically said goodbye, took his wife Tzipora, said goodbye to Yitro that he had been working for a number of years. And it was a very amicable parting of ways. And in the ancient world, once you said goodbye and went to a different country, you generally didn't communicate very much. All of a sudden, Yitro was inspired to have some kind of reunion with his son-in-law and his daughter. What is it that inspired him? So the Talmud debates what it is exactly that prompted him. Tanoi, there's a machlokes, a dispute among the rabbis. Okay, ma shemua shama uba v'nitgayer. What did he actually hear that caused him to come and convert to Judaism? The Talmud is assuming that Yitro converted to Judaism in some way or shape or form. Okay, so Rabbi Yeshua says, Milchemet Amalek Shama. He heard about the war with Amalek and how the Jews, this nascent ragtag group of people who were formerly slaves just 5 minutes ago, managed to defeat this fierce tribe of warriors. Okay, how could that happen if not for God's divine aid? Rabbi Eliezer Hamodai Omer Matan Torah Shama Uba. He says that he heard about the giving of the Torah, and that's what prompted him to come. Shekeshenitna Torah liYisrael haya kolo holech misof haolam ve'ad sofo. That when the Torah was being given, the sound of the giving of the Torah reverberated throughout the world. And that's what Yitro heard about that inspired him to come. The Chol Malchei Ovdei Kochavim Achazatan Ra'ada Behechalehen Va'amru Shira. And all of the kings of all the different countries throughout the world were filled with this sense of trepidation in their palaces, which prompted them to sing to God. Okay, that's the second opinion. So first opinion is that he heard about the war with Amalek, and that was inspiring to him. Second is he heard about the giving of the Torah, and that was inspiring to him. And then we have the third opinion of Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Kriyat Yamsuf Shama Uba, that he heard about the splitting of the Red Sea. Okay? Those are the three things he heard about. Now, we have a machloket. Rabbi Yehoshua says one thing, Rabbi Eliezer Hamodai says another thing, and Rabbi Eliezer says a third thing. It's either the Amalek war, the giving of the Torah, or the splitting of the Red Sea. Everyone with me? So far, it's very simple, right? We take a look at Rashi. Now, if I were to ask you a very simple question, what was Rashi's project when he wrote his commentary to the Torah? How would you answer that question? If a person who had never studied Rashi before, and you were to tell him, well, if you really want to study Chumash properly, you've got to study it with Rashi's commentary. Why? What does Rashi add to the text? Can anyone answer that question in one sentence or less? Go ahead, Karen. What?
there's a problem in the text, then he needs to ask the question, what is the problem in the text?
Would that be a comprehensive encapsulation of Rashi's project? That's what I want to ask you. In other words, what makes Rashi different from his grandson, the Rashbam, for example, or from the Ibn Ezra, or from the Ramban, who comes after him, or Reb Sajigon, who comes before him? What makes Rashi unique? Yeah, yes, he does, but that's not the full answer. Because if that were the full answer, we would be perplexed by why Rashi says so many things that he does say. There's more to it than that. What makes him unique? What makes him different from the Ibn Ezra, for example? Anyone? Yes. His simplicity is so important. Yes, he had the uncanny ability to concisely and simplistically represent his commentary. But here's the one thing that it's so important for us to remind ourselves. Rashi's project is to superimpose Torah Sheba'al Peh on Torah Shebichtav. Okay? It is absolutely necessary to understand that that's part of Rashi's project, because otherwise Rashi doesn't make any sense. Why he says the things he writes in every single commentary. His project is to simplistically, concisely fuse together our oral tradition with the psukim that he's commenting upon. Okay, and that's important for us to know. He takes the most simple Lefi Pshuto explanation, but he culls almost exclusively from our oral tradition. When I say our oral tradition, I mean the Talmud or the Midrash. You will very rarely find Rashi explaining things, unless he needs to explain, let's say, a vocabulary concept. But when he wants to try and explain, let's say, what did Yitro hear, he will cull from the oral tradition, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, in order to explain what he heard. He's not going to do like what the Ibn Ezra or the Rashbam do, which is, for example, to say, this was what is logical to me. He will instead say, the most simple understanding of the text based on Torah Sheba'al Peh is this. Okay? So it's important that you...
Separate alphabet, all the letters,
So in all likelihood, that was not innovated by Rashi. Rashi wrote in regular Hebrew letters. It was later publishers who wanted to make sure that we understood the difference between the biblical text and the commentary to the text, who created this new alphabet. It's not, we call it Rashi script, but it wasn't, he didn't invent it. It came much later. Okay? So this is a very important thing. So if Rashi is going to tell me, Ma Shemua Shama Uba, what did he hear that prompted him to come, we would expect him to either present us with one answer or the three answers that he's basing himself upon in the Talmud or the Mechilta. But Rashi over here answers by saying, Kriyas Yamsuf Umilchemes Amalek. He heard about two things, the splitting of the Red Sea and the war with Amalek. Now that's very strange. It's very strange for Rashi to cull from Torah Sheba'al Peh, but misrepresent it by giving two answers out of the three. And not only that, but instead of saying one rabbi says this, which he quite often does, one rabbi says, for example, in Parshas Noach, when the Torah says, Tzohar ta'aseh lateva, you shall make a tzohar for the ark, is what God commands Noach. So Rashi there says, there's a dispute what a tzohar is. One rabbi says that a tzohar is a window. Another rabbi says that a tzohar is this special gem that has the power of luminescence to light up the ark. And there you have two different opinions. Over here, Rashi does not represent these two opinions as one rabbi says that he heard about the splitting of the Red Sea. The other rabbi says that he heard about the war with Amalek. So we have really two questions on Rashi. Question number one, why does he only bring 2 out of the 3 opinions that appear in the Talmud and the Mechilta, and he completely ignores the giving of the Torah as what prompted Yitro to come? And question number 2 is, of those 2 opinions, he doesn't represent them as 2 separate opinions from 2 different rabbis, but instead says he heard about 2 things, and that's what prompted him to come. Okay, he heard about the splitting of the Red Sea and the war with Amalek. Go ahead, Karen.
But he doesn't need to go to any other sources, because just in the text, Yitro comes before the giving of the Torah, so therefore it couldn't have been that he heard about the giving of the Torah, because it hasn't happened yet.
It hasn't happened yet. But what do you know about Rashi? What does Rashi
Okay.
quite often tell us? Ein mukdam u'muchar b'Torah. Rashi in just a couple of parshiot is going to tell us that the reason for the construction of the Mishkan was a result of the golden calf sin, even though the commandment to build the Mishkan precedes the story of the sin of the golden calf.
Okay, but I'm saying, from the logical point of view, he doesn't need to bring who says this and who says this, because according to his reader, who doesn't know necessarily that Rashi feels about Torah, it's gonna be perfectly fine. Okay, sorry.
I'm saying if the whole reason is because of chronologically it is written before the giving of the Torah, Rashi could have easily reconciled himself with that opinion in the Talmud, right? He could have easily reconciled himself, as he does quite often. Okay, so I'm not sure that that's going to fully answer the question, although we will see that there is, the Sifsei Chachamim suggests something that is akin to that. Yes. Yes, let us go back. Okay, go ahead.
Maybe because in the pasuk it doesn't reference anything about Matan Torah. It says what Hashem did for them, and then he took them out of Mitzrayim. So
It doesn't say anything about Amalek. It doesn't say anything about the splitting of the Red Sea, both of which happened after Yetzias Mitzrayim, correct?
but you could infer from that, I guess, that those 2 things happened, but it doesn't reference anything about Matan Torah.
It doesn't reference anything about Kriyas Yamsuf or Milchemes Amalek either.
That's what
He also did Matan Torah for them. Okay. Anyway, I'm just raising these questions. The commentaries on this Rashi are quite robust. And just to take a look at 2 of them, I'll have to speak it out outside because we're running out of time. The Mizrahi, Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi, who's considered to be like one of the primary super commentaries on Rashi. And he asks, first of all, Rashi is of the opinion that these 2 opinions are not disagreeing with each other. In other words, even though they're represented in the Talmud as 2 separate opinions, Rashi feels that they are complementary to each other and not at all in opposition. So why then does he not bring the 3rd opinion? That's the way he presents the question. And his answer is, the Kriyat Yamsuf u'Milchemet Amalek hem krovim lipshuto shel mikra. The classic answer is that Rashi only gives us the simple understanding of the text. And because Kriyas Yamsuf was so monumental, and Milchemes Amalek was immediately adjacent to Kriyas Yamsuf and Yetzias Mitzrayim, that's the reason why, says Rashi, believes those are the 2 most likely things that Yitro heard about, because the giving of the Torah came later. It came 7 weeks after we left Egypt, and not adjacent to Yetzias Mitzrayim, as the verse says, that Yitro heard about what happened when God took us out of Egypt. And that's the reason why Rashi omits it, not simply because he feels that it is not in alignment with the pshat, with the simple understanding of the text. The Sifsei Chachamim suggests what Karen was saying, is that there are 2 opinions in Tractate Zvachim when Matan Torah took place. Did it take place before Yitro came or after Yitro came? And Rashi simply subscribes to the opinion that Yitro came before Matan Torah. So he couldn't have heard about it as the impetus for coming because it hadn't happened yet. Okay. I want to share with you a slightly different opinion. We've talked in the Kuzari why, when God introduces himself to the Jewish people in the 10 Commandments that we're going to read about in this week's Parsha, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, finish the sentence, I am the Lord your God, Asher Hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mi beit avadim. When God introduced himself to the Jews, how did he choose to introduce himself? Did he say, I am God who created heaven and earth? Wouldn't that be a great way of introducing yourself if you're God? Like, I am the Lord your God who is responsible for all of existence. Yeah? Isn't that a more impressive way of introducing yourself than saying, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt? Okay, so the famous question that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi asks and the Ibn Ezra ask is, why did God introduce himself as the God who took us out of Egypt? Why didn't he introduce himself as the God who created heaven and earth and is responsible for everything? Okay, so we talked about this many moons ago. I'm not going to focus on it now because we're short on time. But the Mechilta gives a different answer. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, says the Mechilta, Lama ne'emar. Why is it written in this way? And I believe that the underlying question of the Mechilta is, why use the word Anochi and not Ani? What's the difference between Anochi and Ani? They both mean I. So does anyone know the difference between Anochi and Ani? Anyone know the difference?
Is Anochi plural?
Nope, it means I. Okay, what's the difference? Anyone? Anochi is stronger. So if I was going to do an exercise in English, you can ask a question, who is that sitting over there? It might mean two completely different things. Meaning you are either seeking to know the identity of that person sitting, or you may be wishing to know who is sitting and not standing. In other words, is the emphasis on the identity of the individual, or is it on the action that the individual is doing? So if you say, Ani Hashem Elokecha asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim, that I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, I mean, that's the important thing, then you would use the word Ani. But if you wanted to emphasize, I am sitting, not standing, versus I am sitting and not standing, you would say Anochi. It's me, Hashem. I'm the one who took you out of Egypt, not some other God. I'm the one who took you out of Egypt. And that's the Mechilta's way of saying, why did God place the emphasis on I and not on the action of taking us out of Egypt? And the answer that the Mechilta gives, Lefi shenigla al hayam ki gibor osem milchamot. And the answer is because God revealed himself up until now in a very different way from the way that he had revealed himself to the Jews up until now. Shenemar Hashem ish milchama. God always portrayed himself as a man of war, as a retributive God, as a God who brings violence and retribution and punishment and plagues upon the world in order to save the Jewish people. But Nigla al Har Sinai kizakein malei rachamim. But when God revealed himself on Mount Sinai, he revealed himself as a completely different God, as a God who's like an elder father, an elder statesman, who's very gently providing you with wisdom and advice, filled with compassion. And shelo litain pitchon pe le'umot ha'olam lomar shtei rishuyotein. This is, God did not want the other nations to think that there were two gods, the God of retribution and war and the God of compassion and wisdom. Two different gods, because that's the pantheism of the ancient world was what had to be counteracted. And therefore, Ela Anochi Hashem Elokecha, Ani b'Mitzrayim, Ani al Hayam, Ani b'Sinai, Ani l'she'avar, Ani la'atid lavo, Ani la'olam hazeh, Ani la'olam haba. I'm the same God who took you out of Egypt as a man of war, is the same God who compassionately and wisely gives you the Torah. I am the God of before, and I'm the God of the future. I'm the God of this world and I'm the God of the next world. That's why Hashem says, Anochi, it's me, it's the same being, not someone different from who took you out of Egypt. Now, if we understand it that way, this is the reason why I think that Rashi omits the giving of the Torah. Because Rashi looks at the psukim and he says, what did Yitro hear that prompted him to come? He was so impressed because Yitro had a very simplistic and paganistic view of deity. And he genuinely believed that the reason to adhere to the God of the Jews is because he's the biggest and baddest God there is out there. He's the God who's capable of bringing absolute retribution to anyone he doesn't like. And therefore, I better join the Jews if I want to be on the winning team. If I want to, like it was just Super Bowl Sunday, right? So who's going to win the game? God is always going to win that game. No one can beat God. And that's why I want to be on God's team, the God of the Jews. But the God of compassion and wisdom, that was never part of Yitro's attraction. And that's the reason why immediately before Matan Torah, we see two things. One, Vayishalach Moshe et choteno vayelech lo el artso. Moshe sent away his father-in-law before the giving of the Torah. He said, nice to have dinner with you. It was so wonderful seeing you. Would you like me to call an Uber for you, or do you have your own transportation? And he sent him away. He sent him away. He sent him back home. Why did Moshe send Yitro away right before the giving of the Torah? The answer is because Moshe perceived that Yitro's attraction to Judaism was because we are running away from an enemy and God will always be there to save us. But he had nothing to run towards. Yitro didn't understand the God of wisdom and compassion. And therefore Moshe felt that he wasn't shayach, he wasn't someone who could appreciate this new guise of the Ribbono Shel Olam. And that's why the Torah says right afterwards, B'chodesh hashalishi letzeit b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim, b'yom hazeh ba'u midbar Sinai. The Torah creates a bridge verse to tell us the third month after we left Egypt, we came to Mount Sinai to bridge the event at Yetziat Mitzrayim to the event at Mount Sinai, to remind us, like the Mechilta says, it's the same God. Same event, the two events are bridged together by the same Hashem, the same Anochi Hashem Elokecha. And this is such an important point because even in Judaism today, you have different kinds of Jews who are attracted to Judaism, some for the good reason and some for the bad reason. You can have a Yitro-esque kind of Jew who is attracted to Judaism because he views the world as a Super Bowl. And if we want to be on the winning side, we got to stick with Hashem because God is a retributive God. And if you're not careful and if you don't side with Hashem, you may be stricken down. But the reason to be attracted to Judaism, which is really what Matan Torah is all about, is that it's the same God who provides us with such beauty and such profundity of knowledge and such compassion in the way that he presents us with this way of life. And if you only see the former and you don't see the latter, then you don't belong with the experience of Matan Torah. To be a part of that experience, you have to see the greatness and the depth of Torah knowledge. Yes?
If he had Moshe live with him all those years, wouldn't he have had a chance to see both sides of Hashem?
Moshe's first revelation was at the burning bush, remember? And then immediately after, what happens? He packs up and says, Shalom, shalom. Okay, we'll hold it here because we're already over time. I'm sorry. And everyone have a wonderful week. And B'ezrat Hashem, we'll see you next time. Take care.